So I would like to introduce the third and final candidate that we have for this evening, Alize Asberry Payne. Did I say that correctly? Ms. Payne is a community organizer and program specialist with more than 20 years of experience in organizational development, strategic planning, campaign design, budget management, and program evaluation. Much of her career has been in San Francisco, California, with the past 3 years in Detroit. Additionally, Ms. Payne is a restorative justice practitioner. So I would like to welcome, you can help me welcome, Ms.
Good evening.
Good evening.
Yeah, it looks like the mic is going to cooperate sometimes and not the whole time. I am so excited to see such a full crowd here this evening. It's inspirational how much buy-in there is in the community around this process. So I am presenting the prompt that I was given was my vision for racial equity if I was selected for this role as part of the community. So what we know right now is inequity in the Washtenaw County is based upon place and race, and if we are going to make systemic change, that has to be something that is explicitly addressed at every step of the process moving forward. When we talk about inequity, there are many different things that filter into that, starting with historic impacts and root causes. You go through this cycle of inequity and impacts from the criminal justice system. You see wealth disparity, health disparity, gerrymandering, voter suppression, implicit and explicit bias in our institutions that filters onto individual impacts, and then you get compound marginalization. So an example of compounding inequity. Sorry, I apologize. I thought I was going to have a clicker, so I was a little bit unprepared for Justin to have to gesture to Justin. So an example of compounding inequity, excuse us, hit all the way through to the bottom of this one. Race, socioeconomic status, and poor educational outcomes or opportunities give us generational poverty. You can use this model looking at not just race, but gender, immigration status, sexual identity, gender binary presentation, but all of these things filter in together and you end up with levels of inequity. In this process, it's really important to define that we are not talking about equality, we are talking about equity. If I need something to drink and you need something to eat, it does not serve me if all I get is water. What we want to be building is a system where people are having their needs met and quality of life is being improved systemically. This is something that comes up anytime you start talking about how we address systemic inequity and individual impacts. Frequently a person will say, well, I experience oppression. Well, that also means that you can have privilege living in your body at the same time. One does not cancel out the other. And it's important when going through this kind of a process, especially at the early stages, to acknowledge that, to address that, and to understand that it can be uncomfortable to confront the fact that you personally may have privilege and you're dealing with oppression. So a good example of that would be, I'm a Black woman. I experience oppression based upon my move through life as a Black woman, but I'm also a natural born citizen. So I do not deal with the same level of oppression related to my documentation status as somebody who does not have documentation in the United States. So I want to get really clear about how I saw this in terms of a plan. First and foremost, there's been a lot of groundwork that has been done to even get the community to this particular point. And it's so critical that that process is honored and reviewed, but that it doesn't stop there. That's just a beginning phase of it. Building out an effective team and pulling people in, establishing clear community engagement process and a clear pathway around communication is really critical to establishing effective benchmarks. So when we're talking about inclusionary process, it's critical that we are making the process accessible. If it is not intentionally accessible, then by default it is exclusionary. And that means respecting where people are coming from in their process. So a person who may not be highly educated is still an expert in their own experience. And a person who is highly educated does not necessarily become an expert in another person's experience if they have not lived it. So when we talk about advocacy, advocacy and engagement, there are levels to the process. Parachute advocacy means you come in and you have great intention, but you may not actually be a part of the community that's being impacted, and typically the results for that kind of advocacy only last as long as the champion who was leading the work is in place. Once that person disappears, the results go away. So authentic engagement. You are being included in the process, and that is fantastic. You see much longer impacts. Generally, it's a more sustainable process. I personally believe that the most effective way that you see systemic change is when you have collective accountability. We collectively work together to build the thing that we are trying to get to. Everybody is bought into that process. It is much longer. It takes a lot more work. And you hit a lot more roadblocks than somebody just dropping in and saying, I have all the solutions. I know how we can fix this problem. But this last piece around collective accountability, that's how we build systemic change long term. So in the room this evening, I see diversity and I see many wonderful faces, but who is not here and why are they not present? That is a question that needs to be asked at every single step of the process. When you address barriers to participation, is it a meeting location? Is it the time of the meeting? Was there childcare available? Was there translation services available? Those are things that you look at. Oftentimes people get tired, especially folks who have been working on a problem for a long time. They start feeling like, well, we're not actually going to see any change, and become apathetic. Are the spaces safe? If a person is, especially if they're holding an opinion that is different than the group, is it a safe space for them to come into? If they're a part of a traditionally marginalized community already, is the space that is being created safe in terms of their participation? What do they risk by showing up? And how is the community and the process supporting their engagement? So by month 6, we should have gone from establishing what a baseline looks like to actually getting to some work. I'm a firm believer that you conduct assessment and engagement every single step of the way, every part of the way. It's impossible to know how far you have gone if you don't know where you've come from. But it's also very, very difficult to know where you're failing if you're not measuring the things that have and have not been working. One of the things that has excited me so much about this particular office is that there is a concrete buy-in from government around this. This is a process that is demanding transparency and incorporation into institutions. At 6 months, the idea is all of the departments are participating effectively in racial equity action plans. So the prompt I was given jumped from 6 months to 5 years, which is a pretty significant jump, and not how I tend to look at process. Because of course, by year 5, we've gotten everything solved and everything's perfect, right? But year 1 is about building out an authentic process and really getting folks engaged, making sure that people are participating, making sure that there is systemic buy-in from government, making sure that we are bringing not just the institutions and community to the table, but nonprofits, NGOs, private entities are participating as well. I always start off an engagement process and collective accountability process with listening to the people who are being most heavily and highly impacted, because those are the folks who are experts in their experience. And that does not just mean going out into the community and talking to people, that also means providing safe space to do internal evaluation within government. There are folks in our institutions who know what the problems are, but are either scared to speak up about them or haven't been given an adequate space or process to do so. So creating that, building that out is really important. This becomes a tough one. So I believe in calling the monster. I believe in confronting problems head on. You do that in safe and loving ways, but you have to be transparent and honest about what you are doing and what the hope is in terms of what you're trying to get out of the process. Creating spaces where we are shifting government by including the most marginalized voices in our institutions. This process is talking about systemic change. It's not a community listening tour that goes on for a year and a half and then it goes away. The idea is that we're seeing long-lasting changes in our community and that they will survive past the point of anybody in this room being involved in them. Key questions that have to be asked: how are people who have been traditionally marginalized, who deal with compounding inequity, how are they being included in the process? What is the plan? Not the idea, not the goal, but what is the plan to increase their visibility and actual effective leadership? And how are we holding ourselves accountable to that? I like looking at impacts. Impacts are measurable. These are the things that we want to see come out of the process. In looking at the current state of inequity in Washtenaw County, there were some things that stood out in terms of where there are challenges in places where if you are a certain race, you don't have the same outcomes. If you live in a certain zip code, you don't have the same outcomes. If we are not dealing with root causes of those things, I heard recidivism and returning citizens as being one of the concerns that community has. If you're dealing with poverty, if you're providing substance abuse treatment, if you're providing homeless services, if you're providing mental health services, you are dealing with symptoms of a problem. In order to create long-lasting impacts, there has to be results-based evaluation. And we need to be looking at, okay, our populations are dealing with substance abuse, and how do we effectively mitigate that as a problem? Making sure that people have access to treatment is one of the ways that we keep them out of our criminal justice system. Juvenile diversion is something that I'm really, really passionate about. I've built a program around that already in California. Keeping young people out of the criminal justice system as adults starts when they are in middle school, even younger at some points. But if we are making sure that we are keeping them away from incarceration in the first place, and we are using a restorative practices framework to do that, we see systemic long-term impacts and effects. I don't believe in punitive process as being effective. And I think that oftentimes our communities and our institutions, especially government, we end up being in adversarial roles with each other when things start going wrong. I think it's really important that the way that this process is approached, it's been normalized in our institutions. It's part of our culture. It is not something that stands alone and apart, but it is something that is as natural as any other part of our budget process or our legislative process. How do we use that lens and that analysis as we are examining our government systems? And when things don't work, using a restorative practices approach and use a restorative practices framework to figure out how to do things better. So in terms of holistic community impact, maternal and infant mortality rates are a good indicator of how well a society is serving the most vulnerable populations it has. Currently in the United States, Black women, regardless of income, regardless of education, have poor maternal and infant outcomes. This is something that people far smarter than I have been studying for quite some time. And racism, it has been racism as the cause of that. So mitigating that. Once we are dealing specifically with those issues, we'll see improvements in that. Visible representation. A lot of people don't understand how much power boards and commissions in communities have. It's not just about our elected officials, although that is something that is important. Boards and commissions tend to have more day-to-day impact than our one county commissioner who got elected for one term, or our one state representative who got elected for one term. And those are the spaces in which a lot of community change and shift happens. No offense to our elected officials. So data and metrics are phenomenal and fantastic, but a great way to get an indicator of how community is doing is by asking the people that are members of that community. How do people feel in their spaces? Are folks feeling safe? Do they feel like they're being listened to? Do they feel like they're being heard? Do they feel like they have transparency and agency in government process, in their community process? Another way of measuring whether or not you're being successful is, this evening we've got a lot of people here. If the process is not working in the way that it's supposed to work, the number of people participating drops off. And it goes from 100 people in a meeting to 3 people in a meeting. And anyone who's worked in community for any length of time has had that experience where suddenly you have 2 people who showed up when you started off with 120. Typically, that's a sign of an unhealthy process. So this is something, as I started off by saying, this is something that's going to take a lot of time to see real results. At the 5-year mark, we should be looking at what the next 10 years are going to look like. And the people who are not in the room right now should be helping lead that process. If we pulled more people in, if we are being more effective around community accountability and engagement, the expansion will happen in terms of who is participating and helping to shape what the next 10 years look like. I have some ideas around what I think equity looks like, but this is your community. And I think it's disingenuous to try and completely shape the process or shape the benchmarks or the outcomes without making sure that there's full voice and engagement and participation from everyone who's going to be impacted. Not everyone is going to want to participate, and that's fine, but there needs to be a real attempt to make sure that everyone is given voice and agency. By the 10-year mark, this process, this ideas has gone beyond county systems. It's spread to all the municipalities, and it's something that's welcomed and wanted, and people feel like they don't even think about it in terms of this thing that they do. It's been so normalized and institutionalized that folks can't remember when it wasn't really there. I got a laugh on that one. we talk about quality of life, what we're really talking about is parity and making sure that regardless of where you live, regardless of what race you are, your gender expression, sexual orientation, any of those things, that you have the same opportunities and the same measurable outcomes as anyone else in your community. If we're not seeing those measurable changes and those shifts, then the process isn't working and we reevaluate to move forward. So in my perfect world, and I'm an optimist, by 30 years we've seen a generational shift. And you have the first generation born in Washtenaw County that experiences the same positive outcomes regardless of race or zip code. And that's something that is sustained. It's not, again, going back to the advocate parachuting in model, it's not you have one champion who's in the county for 30 years and helped build the process out, he or she disappears and then the process goes away. It's something that everyone has bought into collective ownership in, and you have the model for what equity engagement looks like in Michigan, and have developed a toolkit for what this looks like nationally. So this last slide is really just my philosophy around how I see this process being the most authentic. It's the people who are being most highly impacted in any one area that are leading the process. And systems are being created and shaped intentionally to fold them in and to make sure that they're given agency and voice. To make sure that the things that we are saying in this space that we want to have happen, we are putting resources behind, we're putting manpower or woman power or person power behind, and we're making sure that we're creating a process that really speaks to the best of what we are capable of. I see this as happening through symbiotic relationships in public and private. It's institutional, but it's also community engagement. It's the people who are not in this space. It's the people who don't even know this space exists yet. It's engaging all of the folks that we want to see in the diverse representation of the county. And thank you.
We do have a few questions.
Okay.
And what I would like to do is invite the participants here. If there's any particular questions that you'd like to ask Ms. Payne, at this time you have note cards and pass them, you know the drill. And so while Hannah and Nina are grabbing a couple things, we have a couple of questions just to get us started.
Okay.
We know that we have both support and resistance in our midst. How would you respond to this?
You mean not everybody wants to get the same thing done in the same way? I think that it's important to recognize that folks are motivated by self-interest. And if you can figure out what that interest is, you can get buy-in. So I believe that racial equity is important. And I have built a career around that. Not everybody feels that way. And typically, the further you get from bottom, the less you are concerned with equity, because life is good for you. One of the ways that I have seen pulling people in when they are not necessarily engaged specifically around issues like this, you speak to things like fiscal responsibility, which does not sound exciting, but for someone who is a property owner who does not feel like they necessarily have issues around racial inequity, they do care about crime, and they do care about property values. When you start addressing inequity, when you start addressing issues around poverty, substance abuse, mental health issues, lack of housing, displacement, you reduce crime rates. When you reduce crime rates, you bring property values up. So tying into what people feel like is important, and figuring out what those things are, and understanding that not everybody is going to agree ever.
Thank you. Appreciate that. Next question.
question?
is around, this work requires someone who is resilient and can persevere. How do you sustain yourself in the work?
I watch cartoons. No, it's serious. I take space away from this because I've been doing this work a long time, and I started when I was a very young person, and I've lost some people along the way. And I realized at a certain point it was necessary to be able to understand that I was not going to solve everything that I was set out to do in that day, and to continue to be effective, I had to take space. And so I do things that are completely unrelated to this kind of work. I garden, and I do yoga, and I breathe, and I drink water, and I practice intentional self-care, and sometimes I don't think about how many problems that we have left to fix.
Great, thank you. And then this is from some of the participants that are here. What is or are your strategies for recruiting or getting the absent people that you talked about in the room, getting them to the room?
Go to them. Start off by meeting people where they are at, and understand that a lot of times people are not showing up into these spaces because they are not welcoming for that particular population. So you go and talk to those folks and ask them what they need in order to participate, and then you shape process around that. If you're truly committed to engaging people who are not here, then you reach them where they're at.
Great. Here's another one. It's okay to talk about processes and systems, but what about equity in terms of the necessary resources, the money that is very much needed in the community and in Washtenaw County in order to do the work?
So I have made miracles happen with a very, very tiny or no budget. And that taught me how to be intentional about how we see our resources. Money is absolutely necessary in order to move process forward, but it's not just money. Now, there are huge institutions outside of county government and outside of city government that are in this area. How are those institutions, how are those private institutions being pulled into this process, and how are they helping to resource the process? Additionally, there's this specific kind of work, there's foundation funding that's available. I do work in Detroit currently and have been working around equity there, and there are resources that are available to help fund this. I know people don't like talking about how to pull money out of already strapped county budgets, but it also becomes a question of how committed is the community and the government to making this project successful. We can find money for all kinds of things. If there is a true commitment to this, then we find money for it.
Thank you. How would you navigate, it's a little tricky, how would you navigate between the county administration, which in essence will be your boss and the Board of Commissioners, and advocacy on behalf of your constituents or your constituency in the community? And do you see that equity issues only relate to the county as an employer?
Well, so first and foremost, I believe in shaping collective process, collective accountability. So we are clear that we're defining what the goals are in terms of what we are trying to get accomplished together. And when people have buy-in about what that looks like, folks feel like they have input around what that looks like, I've seen there be fewer problems in terms of conflict of interest. Our goals should, for community advocacy or community engagement in the county, if we are talking about creating a racial equity framework that dismantles root cause issues and deals with some structural systems, we should be able to come together and determine what that platform looks like collectively. And then staying true to what that North Star, that mission is. What's the second part?
How do you see that equity issue, or also, do you see the equity issues
Systems perpetuate inequity. Structures perpetuate inequity. Very infrequently is it an individual, because individuals typically don't have enough power on their own to kind of push these systems forward in the ways that negatively impact our communities. It's not just about, as an employer, the county is responsible. The county is responsible for also helping shape culture and for creating space that is inclusive. So it goes far beyond just employment.
You talked about a couple of programs that you had created and developed in San Francisco and also in Detroit. Could you tell us a little bit more about some of the programs you mentioned, like juvenile systems in San Francisco? Could you tell us a little bit more about some of the efforts you've had?
Sure. So one of my favorite programs in San Francisco, we were working around school to prison pipeline issues as part of a statewide coalition space. And I was given a blank slate and funding, which is like, that's the magic thing, that's the magic one, that never happens. And access to a continuation high school, partnership and support from our district attorney's office, juvenile services, and we went in and built a restorative practices program in the continuation high school. In the first year that we were there, these were young people who had been consistently suspended. Most were currently under juvenile probation supervision. In the first year, we took the suspension rate in the school from 98 suspensions the previous year down to 0 the first year that we were there. And negative contact between our young people, the students who are in the school, and juvenile probation or the criminal justice system, we were able to reduce that by 75%. It was not a perfect program, but it showed that with the right resources, with the right buy-in, with the right partners, progress was possible. I can talk about it.
Oh, please.
That's okay. I would say in Michigan, one of the things that I've worked on most recently that I am really passionate about, we created a community benefits ordinance in Detroit and brought that to the voters as a ballot proposal. And we were able to move 97,000 voters with a $15,000 budget. We were not successful though, because we were outspent by our opposition. They spent $1.5 million to beat us, but they only beat us by 10,000 votes. And that process, that coalition space, created ongoing engagement that has funneled into our city charter process, which we're currently reviewing.
And finally, just one last question. How do you plan to temper advocacy strategies that may have worked well in other environments so that you can be effective inside of county government as well as our community at large?
So I started off by saying, or during my presentation I said that people are experts in their own experience. And I don't subscribe to the parachute advocacy model as being effective. The first step for me would be to talk to the folks who are already stakeholders, who are already participating in this process, about what has been working and what has not been working, and take my lead from you.
Great, thank you so much. I appreciate you being here and